Nelle. I haven't heard a lot of what's been going on the past several minutes, but we're going to go ahead and get a start with this webinar. And I'm going to skip a lot of the things and just get right into it. But this seminar is not about those animals that spend their life around water, such as waterfowl. We're going to be concentrating on animals, that terrestrial wildlife that live on the land. And we're going to be talking about their water requirements, some of the possible benefits of providing water above and beyond their requirements. We'll be looking at different kinds of water developments that are used, and some of the side effects that may take place when we put water on the land. And finally, if time allows, we will kind of look at the big picture of the management of water on the landscape. So we'll begin with whitetail deer, but this applies equally well to mule deer. And we can simply say that that deer need water. They need water every day. It needs to be permanent water located within their home range, spacing 1 to 2 miles apart. They don't seem to care whether that is natural water from a creek or a pond or whether it's out of a trough. They just need water. And the reason for this is that the rumen of deer and other ruminants really must maintain itself at a 60 to 70% water content. If not, the animal simply cannot digest the food that they're eating, so their digestion system shuts down. So deer and other ruminants really do need a good access to permanent water every day. This need for water is especially pronounced during lactation when those does are giving milk, and you can imagine how their water needs would increase during this time. I could tell you some horror stories about ranches that have their water sources have dried up, either due to the ponds drying up or creeks drying up or inattention to maintaining water. And basically the deer pack up and go somewhere else. They'll travel long distances when water dries up. So never underestimate the value and the necessity of keeping good permanent water locations well maintained. We could say pretty much the same thing about pronghorn antelope. They need water every day. It's usually a core part of their home range. And again, during the lactation, when does are giving milk, it's an especially pronounced need for water. Pronghorn have another consideration in addition, besides what deer have, and that is they seem especially prone not to want to cross barriers and other impediments to travel. For some behavioral instinctive thing, they don't feel comfortable crossing fences. This is especially true for net wire fences, which they simply cannot navigate. They don't jump over. But even barbed wire fences, where the bottom wire is too close to the ground, even though it seems odd, that's essentially like an 8-foot deer-proof fence to a pronghorn. And so the application of this is that if water dries up in the pasture where the pronghorn live, they're not going to readily cross to the other pasture unless the fence allows such passage. There are lots of stories of pronghorn dying of dehydration when there's plenty of water right in the next pasture over. And so in order to make fences pronghorn friendly, the bottom wire needs to be at least 16 inches, preferably 18 to 20 inches above the ground. Then pronghorn will pass under to get that water. That's a pretty important consideration in pronghorn ecology and management. Bighorn sheep, same thing. They're ruminants. They need water. The mature males and mature rams can go a long distance for water, but those ewes with lambs, they need to stay pretty close to the water. They're not as mobile as the big mature males. And lots of the efforts of restoring bighorn sheep into Texas have revolved around providing water, because there's not a lot of natural water in the habitat of bighorn. Let's move now to some of the bird species that we're interested in. Turkey, it's pretty well concluded that turkeys need water. Oftentimes a source of water is the center of their home range. They don't seem that particular whether it's natural water such as a creek, which we'd all prefer, or an artificial source of water, but they need water within their home range. That's pretty much been established. And an interesting statistic that Parks and Wildlife discovered back in the 70s was that a very, very high percentage of turkey nests are close to water. 97% of the nests were within 1/2 mile of water. And so that just reiterates again how important permanent water is to wild turkey. They need water. You lose the water, you're going to lose the turkey. Dove, every dove hunter knows that dove need water. Their preferred watering location would be something like a dirt tank or a pond pictured here, but that the shorelines are devoid of thick vegetation. Doves want to be able to see. When they land on the ground and walk down to the water, they don't want to be ambushed by a predator. So having sparse vegetation on the shoreline is an important consideration for ideal dove water. Here's the question that everyone wants the answer to. Do quail need water? This question has been debated and talked about for decades, and there's not been a clear answer either way on the necessity that quail have for water. Actually, we can give a definitive answer, but it's not going to be the one that satisfies you. Quail definitely need water, just like every other living organism. The question is, do quail need freestanding surface water? And that's the big question. Quail and many other birds derive much of their water, if not all of their water, from the things they eat: insects, berries, greens, metabolic water, and even perhaps dew. Now, metabolic water is the water that the body produces during the digestion process. When carbohydrates, starches, and proteins are digested, one of the byproducts is water, and that's metabolic water. It has been discovered that about 1/3 of a quail's need for water can be provided by metabolic water. Well, that begs the question, where do they get the rest of their water? And think of all the times and places, especially during dry times, when there are no insects, there are no berries or greens available, there is no dew. Where do quail get the rest of their water if metabolic water can only provide a portion of it? And that's the question that, in my mind, has never been fully answered by researchers or managers. And it seems as though during these times, water logically, intuitively, might be an important part of a quail's habitat. The scientists are almost unequivocal in saying that quail do not need freestanding surface water, but quail managers on the ground, ranchers and ranch managers, seem to think, many of them, that water is important. It's not vital to the survival of the species, but many would acknowledge that it probably does help during these dry times. And so when it comes to the necessity of quail for surface water, it's not a black and white issue. There's lots of opinions, there's lots of perspectives, and at this point there's really no consensus between the professionals, the scientists, and the on-the-ground managers. I think if you want to put out water and it's feasible and practical for you to do, it perhaps will help. We might say much the same thing about water for songbirds. Everyone knows that songbirds are attracted to water. They drink, they bathe. Oftentimes they spend a lot of time near water. But do they need it as a necessary part of their habitat? To help answer that question for you, I asked a friend and colleague, Burl Armstrong, who's an avid birder, He's a principal with Plateau Wildlife Incorporated. And here's some of the things that Burl communicated to me that I will share with you. First, he said that many birds can find adequate water for survival. In other words, their survival is not necessarily dependent on us providing water. He said that insect-eating birds may need bathing water as much or more than they need drinking water. So that's an interesting perspective. We've all seen birds splash and bathe, and it may be a biological need. Water definitely attracts birds, we all know that, but on the other side, it also attracts predators of birds. So do we have a net gain or do we have a wash? Burl mentioned, and we've often observed this, that dripping water especially seems attractive to songbirds. So anything you can do to provide that drip, 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 it's going to be attractive and attract songbirds. If you have a pressurized water system running across a ranch or a property with a pipeline, drip emitters can be installed, drip lines along that line to create small watering areas. That doesn't require a lot of extra effort or expense. If it's an unpressurized system, for example, running from a windmill to a trough, a siphon can be set up on that trough with tubing, and then that tubing or pipe can be run some distance, 100 feet, 100 yards, away from the water trough to a small puddle near protective cover under a tree. And these are just some ways that Burl mentioned that might be fairly easy and practical to provide water for songbirds. But as he alluded to, there are side effects to everything that we do on the land. And if we put water out there for the desired species, we're also going to be providing water for the predators of those species. So think about that and think the ramifications of that. I'm sure the coyotes and the raccoons and the foxes and the skunks and all manner of what we sometimes class as varmints, they're drinking the same water that we're putting out there for turkey and quail and deer. And big cats need water too. Bobcats and lions, they drink water. They need water. And one rancher in New Mexico who has done extensive watering development for bighorn sheep has found that mountain lions frequently use those same water sources. In fact, he started calling these bighorn sheep watering locations, he calls them lion guzzlers because of the amount of use that they get from lions. So think through these side effects and be prepared that when we put out water for birds or deer, we're going to attract other animals, including hogs. Hogs love water. We all know that. And if you install watering devices that create wet ground or mud holes and puddles, that's going to be attractive to hogs, just like it is the animals you're trying to attract. So be prepared for some management and control of hogs, because they're probably going to take advantage of the water developments also. For sure, traditional livestock water development has played a really important role in the expansion of wildlife in Texas. Literally hundreds of thousands of artificial water developments have been put in all across Texas, and there can be no doubt that these have been extremely important for wildlife over the last 100 years. And these livestock water developments have many alternative uses, and one of which for sure is wildlife. The question we would want to ask ourselves is, are these livestock water development wildlife friendly? In this particular photo, you can see the distance between the lip of the trough and the water itself. And we could certainly ask ourselves the question or make the statement that drinking can perhaps be hazardous to the health of some animals that are really wanting to get a drink of water pretty bad. And so always think and be mindful of the accessibility of the water and escape provisions in case an animal falls in. Here's one way that has been discovered to get around that. With who you see pictured there is Dr. Dale Rollins, no stranger to many of you. And he got this idea from a rancher in West Texas on how to get around that problem. This rancher suggested setting the float of the trough so that the water would be exactly at the very lip of the water trough. And then when the wind blows, it sloshes some water over the edge of the trough down on the ground, creating puddles, creating a wet spot, perhaps even growing some vegetation that might harbor some insects. And so this is one way around that. A lot of ranchers don't like to have mud around the edge of their trough. It creates more erosion and trampling, and it may undermine the trough. It also may attract hogs, this wet area, so think of those things through before you make the decision. Here you see pictured another way around that problem. The water level is well below the lip of the trough, but there's an entrance ramp made of concrete sacks staked to the ground and an escape ramp on the inside. This is being more and more commonly done by ranchers. And here you see it again, the ramp made of concrete sacks, a group of blue quail up there at the top getting their drink of water. There's an escape ramp on the inside in case they fall in. And also notice the little wet area, the small oasis that has been created over to the left where the water slops over, perhaps creating a little bit different microclimate that might be beneficial to birds or other wildlife. Here's a pretty common sense type of escape ramp, which is constructed parallel to the outside edge of the trough. Pretty simple and straightforward, made with expanded metal lath. There's another design that has been recommended, again, so that animals that fall in when trying to drink can find a way to crawl out. Here's actually a picture of a bat that got trapped in there and found a way to escape. Here's a pretty innovative way where the ramp has been actually installed as a part of the trough. This is a fiberglass trough, and that's a really good solution, long-term solution to escape ramps for wildlife. Another solution would be to create separate ground level drinkers. This one is commercially available. It's made of fiberglass. It's got a long sloping ramp for the wildlife to get in and out. The float is protected by a box so it doesn't get messed up by hogs or cattle or anything. Here's sort of a homemade version of the same thing, just made on the ranch with concrete and materials, and you'll notice that it has been designed intentionally to allow a little bit of water to flow over the edge, again to create that ground level water, grow some weeds or some grasses that might also be beneficial to wildlife. And another approach would be to create separate wildlife water locations. You'll notice there's a fence in the background located around this watering location. And here you see mule deer making good use of this small water trough, but livestock don't have access here. The livestock have their own water sources. The deer have their water sources with brushy cover, and probably a little bit better situation to have separately located water troughs for wildlife. Here's a common approach that we see all across Texas, and that's simply having a pipe that runs from the storage tank or the trough, and any overflow that goes into the tank or trough is diverted out this pipe to a nearby depression. These don't have to be large. They can be 10 or 15 feet across or 20 or 30 feet across, but they're fed simply by the overflow from a large storage tank or a trough. Very good for wildlife, not only providing water, but sort of a little man-made wetland area. I think everyone can see the problem that this may cause. This is the large water storage tank. They're typically 6 feet tall, 20 or 30 feet across. Birds that want to get a drink there would have a very difficult time getting out. And so one approach for that would be to install a floating cover on the water tank. Well, this is an industrial application of that same principle, but it simply is using neoprene, the same material that's used in wetsuits, make it into a circle to provide a floating cover, which of course reduces evaporation tremendously, saves water, but then holes can be cut in that cover, 1 to 2 inches in diameter, so that birds can land on that floating cover, walk over to a hole, get their drink, and fly off. No danger of drowning, reduced evaporation, and I've seen these used in New Mexico, especially on Forest Service land, and that's a pretty innovative way to provide escape from these tanks. Next, we'll look at a class of water developments that are called guzzlers. A guzzler is simply the name for a self-contained water development that uses rainfall, which is captured on an apron or a catchment area, piped to a tank, and these have been widely put in the western states, including the Trans-Pecos of Texas, commonly used for mule deer and bighorn sheep, where other water developments are simply not feasible, not practical, not cost-effective. But these can be put together with all kinds of materials, including secondhand material or whatever you have on hand. This particular style has been called a black gap guzzler. It was first designed and installed back in the 60s or 70s for mule deer on the Black Gap WMA. This one is actually pictured on the Elephant Mountain. But then the water is piped from the tanks down to a small ground level drinker, as you see pictured here, to reduce evaporation. Here's another style of commercial drinker where the float valve is encased in the side, built into the side of the drinker. This unit is called an inverted umbrella guzzler. It's commercially available from up in Amarillo. Very, very well made units. I've actually put these together on several occasions. They're very well engineered units. They come as a kit shipped to you. You take them out to the pasture and put them together with bolts, pre-cut holes and everything. And you can see that the lid is extended beyond the edge of the tank. These are a very nice option. They're a little bit pricey, but they're very well made. This unit is called a flying saucer guzzler. The tank itself is buried in the ground. The tank is only 2 feet tall. And the beauty of this unit is that it doesn't need a float valve. There's no float valve to get messed up. The water in the drinker, which this one happens to be dry at the moment because it's just been installed, but the water in the drinker is the same elevation as the water in the tank. The drawback to this system is that limited catchment of rainfall. If you get a 1-inch rain, you get 1 inch of water in your tank. Now these can be augmented by putting external catchments to where when you get 1-inch rain, you may get 2 or 3 inches of water in the tank. But you'll see that the water then flows directly into the drinker, which has a sloped ramp, and no matter what the elevation of water in the tank is, animals still have access, and like I say, without having to monkey with a float valve. Here's another type of catchment that was used more in the past when labor was cheaper, using concrete as the apron with a curb. You can see the tank at the bottom end. With any guzzler unit, you have to be concerned about long-term maintenance. These are not projects that you build and walk away from. They're going to require maintenance and inspection, make sure they're working properly, and so always keep that in mind, the need for maintenance. Here's a homemade type guzzler that's in the process of being constructed. You can see the wooden framework is already in place. The tin will be screwed down to the top of those frames. The tank is simply a commercially available galvanized trough. It will be covered by the catchment apron itself and then piped to a small drinker. So these things can be constructed really according to your imagination, what materials you have, and just let creativity guide you on how to build these things. Here's a commercially available unit called a 4-wing Guzzler, and you can see that the tank is obviously in the center. It has 2 drinkers attached to the Guzzler, permanently attached. One is up at 24 inches high or so for deer and other type animals, and one is underneath the Guzzler, protected by fence material for quail to get in there to drink. This is not technically a Guzzler, but it's sort of a modified Guzzler type unit. The water there is in a rock basin, natural rock basin called a tinaja. They're common in the canyons and some of the mountainous country. And what they've done here is simply create a roof over the tinaja to reduce evaporation. And the roof, of course, also serves to catch extra runoff and directing it into the tinaja. So these can be important and common sense ways to provide water. Here's a unit that is not a Guzzler, it's simply a tank and a drinker. This unit requires that the water be hauled to the tank periodically, so it requires more input, and obviously that's a chemical container. The user would definitely have to be extremely careful to rinse out and wash out and remove all traces of whatever chemicals may have been in that tank. Similar concept here, smaller tank, but readily available material. But units like this can be put in, but they do require water to be hauled to them from a water tank. There are 3 publications I would like to make you aware of that might be helpful to you if you're planning some water development on your ranch. This one is actually published by Bat Conservation International, but don't let that name fool you. The material in this book is very practical for all kinds of wildlife. This can be downloaded free on the internet. Just put your search in for BCI Water for Wildlife and you can get it free off the internet. You can probably also get a free copy by contacting Bat Conservation International. The second publication is put out by Texas Parks and Wildlife. This one is also available on the internet if you want to get it a PDF. Just type in Water for West Texas Wildlife, and some of the same information I've covered, some designs and other information is available in these good publications. The third one is available through AgriLife Extension. It's publication B6182. This one you might be able to get from your local county extension agent. Otherwise, you can purchase it from the AgriLife bookstore. Just make sure that you either know the name or the number of that publication. And you'll find all of these helpful and practical for creating wildlife water. Obviously, if you have ponds on your property, they're a great asset for wildlife. No doubt about that. All kinds of wildlife use ponds. If you're considering building a pond on your property, here are some things you want to think about ahead of time before you ever hire the bulldozer and try to dig the pond. You'll need to consider how deep the pond needs to be for your part of the state. You'll need to know what kind of soil materials you're dealing with down deep. The drainage area that feeds water into the pond is a critical factor. Making sure you have a good location for an adequate spillway is another important consideration for a pond. The evaporation loss that you'll have every year. Siltation issues down the road. All these ponds eventually begin to fill with sediment. And so to help you with these considerations, I would strongly recommend that you get professional help from your local NRCS office. They have technicians and or engineers with a great amount of practical experience and knowledge about building and designing ponds in your particular county. So contact your NRCS office on that. Obviously, ponds that have natural vegetation along the edge have some additional value besides just providing water. And so we think of managing to create good vegetative conditions along the edge of the pond, not just barren shorelines as you see pictured here. And so some people will fence off a portion or all of a pond to create the buffer area, that vegetated area. This pond has been completely fenced off from livestock, and here's how it would look from the top. You have your pond and your dam, and you build a fence around the pond, but then to allow livestock to water, you create a fenced lane down to the pond. In this way, the entire shoreline is vegetated, the spillway stays vegetated, and here's how that might look on the ground. In this example, they've used PVC pipe and electric wire to keep cattle from swimming out across the lake to get out. Here's another view of the same sort of thing, restricting livestock access to certain areas of the pond or creek to maintain good shoreline vegetation. If you're fortunate enough to have natural seeps or springs or tinajas, you might want to consider fencing those off, excluding livestock from those for this reason. It does not take very long for a group of cattle to suck one of those dry. Cattle drinking 15 gallons a day during the summer might not take very long to eliminate the water in those. So that's a consideration to think about. And I want to spend the rest of our time talking about the land/water connection. That question mark should be a slash mark, the land-water connection. Kind of looking at the big picture of how do we manage water on the large landscape. And back nearly 100 years ago, a fellow named Mr. R.E. Dixon said, "Don't pray for rain if you can't take care of it." What did he mean by that statement? What he meant was managing the land to make the most of your rain. And what he meant was that the essence of good land/water management means keeping a healthy cover of desirable vegetation on the ground and minimizing bare ground. If you look straight down at the ground, right at your boot, evaluate the amount of plant cover versus bare ground, bad things happen when raindrops strike bare ground. And much of that is under the control of the landowner or the land manager. When raindrops continually pound the surface of the ground, what they end up doing, in effect, is putting a glaze or really on top of the surface of the ground so that it becomes somewhat impervious to rainfall. And so we see it raining, but we don't see the water going in the ground. It puddles on the surface, it runs off. And so what we see pictured in many cases is what we would call a dysfunctional water cycle, where the ground simply is not in a condition to absorb rainfall. And this is actually a function of management as much or more than it is a function of drought. Lands like this, we use the term they're in a perpetual drought because the water cycle is not working the way it's supposed to. I think everyone here understands what the definition of a watershed is, but in other countries, in Australia and in Africa, they don't use the word watershed to refer to that unit of land. Instead, they call that a water catchment. And really, if we think about it, that's a much better term that portrays what we want to be happening on the landscape. In most cases, we want the land to be catching water, to be holding water, to be storing water. We don't want it to act like the roof of a barn and shed water. So a water catchment is really the exact opposite of a water guzzler, where we're trying to intercept water. But as far as land management goes, we really want to be promoting a landscape that catches and holds water. And if we look at a fence line contrast, we can see that one side is in fact functioning like a water catchment, the other side more like a watershed. And as you look at that hillside, just think about the fate of a hard 2-inch rain. Think about what's going to happen to that 2 inches of water. And I think most of us would agree that we want conditions that allow water to go into the ground rather than run off, creating erosion and problems down the slope. Well, it has been said that those who do not understand natural resources are destined to deplete them. And I think if you think about that statement, there's some truth to it. But the corollary to that, and the other side of the coin, is that those who understand natural resources the best are compelled to conserve them. And that's one of the core messages, I think, of the Texas Wildlife Association, helping people to better understand natural resources and nature. And that is the motivation and the compulsion that helps people want to become better managers, better conservationists, better stewards. And so we see again this dichotomy here of land that's poorly understood and poorly managed, shedding water, and we see the opposite on the lower side of the fence. So what we want to be striving for in everything we do on the land is to promote a healthy, properly functioning water cycle. And that's what Mr. Dixon meant. When the land absorbs water in rainfall events and the water is allowed to soak into the ground, some of it gets below the root zone and follows the cracks and crevices down into aquifers. And so we not only get healthy landscape, but we get water moving into subsurface aquifers and water tables. And so really the key principle of land water management, if we had to boil it down to one statement, is slowing the movement of water as it flows downhill. And that water is slowed by plants, by leaf litter, by vegetation. It can be grassy or it can be woody vegetation, which slows down the water, helping it to soak in. And the message that really all Texas needs to understand, I think landowners understand it intuitively, but that water comes from the land. Water does not come from your local utility or the Corps of Engineers lake. Water is a product of the land, just as wildlife or livestock or crops are a product of the land. And the amount and distribution and quality of that water is strongly determined by how that land is managed. And so here's just a few statements about how land stewardship helps to process and protect the water resources of Texas by helping the land to absorb the rainfall. The rainfall is then stored in the soil, and then it is released in moderation more slowly over time for a more even distribution. And this helps to prolong the base flow of creeks, of seeps, and springs. This is one thing we all want. And on top of that, it helps to maintain high quality water. So the things that happen on the land really and truly do affect the waters of Texas. And here's the results when large blocks of land do this kind of management. We'll tend to have clean, more reliable supplies of water, abundant livestock forage if you're in the ranching business, abundant and rich fish and wildlife habitat, and then all those intangible aesthetic values that we all enjoy, the recreational value and the natural beauty. So with that, I will end with the same slide we started with and maybe see if there's any questions that could be discussed or addressed at this time. Thank you again for staying with us during the technical difficulties, and I'll turn this back over to Eleanor.
great. Yeah, thank you so much. And if anybody does have any questions, if you could please post them in the chat window, make sure you send it to all participants. We actually do have one question that's already come up. And the question is, where could we purchase a small ground level drinker?
Okay, that's a good question. The question, where can we purchase a small ground level drinker? And I don't have the vendors on the top of my head. I believe that in the TWA magazine, there has been advertisements for these. So if you'll pick up a copy of Texas Wildlife and thumb through there, I think in the past I recall seeing advertisements, but I don't have the names of those vendors at the tip of my tongue right now. I'm sorry.
All right, no worries. I'm sure that's a start. And if anyone else has any questions, please post them again, like I said, in the chat window. Not seeing any come up at the moment, but I'm sure usually we get a whole bunch of questions all at once. So thank y'all, like Steve said, for sticking around. We had some technical difficulties, but I think it ended up quite well. So
I will say a few things while people think about if they have any questions, and that is people oftentimes wonder, how do you design a guzzler? In other words, what size of catchment and what size of tank? And that can be somewhat of an involved design, but here's what you want to think about. For every 100 square feet of catchment, you're going to get 60 gallons of water for every 1 inch rain. So in the drier parts of the state, you're going to want a bigger catchment because rains are less, there's less volume of rain and they're less frequent. So larger catchments, and we're thinking here 500 to 1,000 square feet, are going to be what's needed in the Trans-Pecos, where we're talking about 8 to 10 inches of rain, and perhaps a tank size of 2,000 to 3,000 gallons. These are larger size guzzlers, meant for bighorns and mule deer. And the water in that tank may have to last 6 to 12 months between rainfall events. In the wetter part of the state, the catchments can be much smaller because the rain is more frequent. And so you really have to know which part of the state you're in, what your average rainfall is, and how many deer or animals you're going to try to support with that guzzler. But the main thing to think about now is just the fact of 0.6 of a gallon for every square foot of catchment.
all right, thank you for that. And I see a few different people have made some posts up here of where you can get some drinkers, so that's good. Just by the way, everybody, while I'm just waiting for some more questions, these webinars are all available on our website. I'm about to post a link to that right here. All right, so you can find all of our recorded webinars available if you just go to our website, texas-wildlife.org, and we'll try and get this one up sometime next week. And this one as well is being recorded as well. So you can view this in any of our previously recorded webinars at the link I just posted. All right, I'm not really seeing any questions come in. So just give people a couple minutes. And thank you, Steve, for coming and sharing your knowledge in this presentation today.
Well,
lots of good information in there.
I was definitely happy to do it. It's been something that I've been interested in for a long time, and I've had some building guzzlers out in the Chihuahuan Desert can be a back-breaking project, and I could do that when I was younger, but you want to get some young people if you're going to be making the guzzlers from scratch. But it's very gratifying to build something like that and watch wildlife use it and see populations of mule deer or bighorn sheep begin to use these water devices.
All right, we got a couple people saying great job and thank you, but other than that, I'm not seeing any questions. So seems like you covered everything people needed to know. It sounds like. We'll give it another, minute or so, and if we don't get any more questions, then we can close out the program.
Well, I think the thing that is the greatest thing of all is the great rains that most of the state got this week, and so that made the prices for wildlife a little bit less. I mean, it's going to get hot and dry again, but for the time being, we have lots of water on the landscape. We have puddles and creeks, and we have a lot better water situation. Thank the Lord for that. So maybe people are not sweating it quite so much as they would have been a couple of weeks ago.
Oh yeah, for sure. Ooh, here's a question. What and where is financial assistance available to help landowners to provide additional water sources on their land?
Okay, good question. The Natural Resources Conservation Service has several landowner assistance programs where they provide financial assistance for all kinds of different conservation practices, including water development, both for livestock and for wildlife. So if you are not familiar with your local NRCS office, you want to go and meet those folks. There's an office in every county. They have a program that's called EQIP, Environmental Quality Incentive Program, another program called WIP, Wildlife Habitat Incentive Program, and there are cost incentives available to landowners to install guzzlers, to drill wells, to put in tanks, troughs, pipelines, as a part of an integrated conservation program. And the cost incentives are really pretty generous. They oftentimes will cover half or sometimes more than half of the cost of a guzzler or a water development. So go see the local NRCS office for details on that.
All right. Thank you very much. Not seeing any more questions coming in, so if you've got a last-minute question, please post it quickly. Our next Wildlife for Lunch will be on August 15th, and it is going to cover brush sculpting with wildlife in mind. Our presenter next month is Ken Searley, so hopefully you'll join us all on August 15th next month. So I'm not seeing any more questions. So someone made a comment, but no more questions. So with that, if there's no more questions, I guess that'll be it for today. So thank you again, Steve. This is a wonderful presentation, and hopefully we'll see you guys all next month.
Thank you, Eleanor, and thank you to all the participants. I've enjoyed